welcome to the Monday, January 24th meeting of the TAP Committee. This morning we have, as always, a pretty full agenda, so we'll dig right in. But I'm going to start with introductions, especially since we have a few new key people on our team. So let's go ahead with council. I'm Julie Eisel, Mayor Pro Tem, and serving as chair of this committee.
Larkin Eggleston, Committee Vice Chair.
Malcolm Graham, Committee Member.
Okay, we're still waiting for Mr. Winston, and Ms. Watlington cannot attend. So let's go ahead with staff. We'll start with Ed. We'll get to him.
Jason Lawrence, Charlotte Area Transit System.
Alicia Osborne, Planning Department.
Liz Babson, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Allison Craig, Planning.
Lynn Alexander, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Thank you, and I see we have another committee member joining us, Mr. Winston.
Good morning, Braxton Winston, Committee Member, serving at large.
Thank you, and we have some other council members. Always glad to have other council members join the discussion. Want to introduce yourself?
Ed Driggs, District 7.
Okay, that looks like it's it. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. The first item that we have this morning is the policy map update for the 2040 policy map. And we're going to turn it over to staff. Alicia Osborne and Kathy Cornett will be speaking. And I just wanted to mention that we have Liz Babson, our Director of Transportation, is our new hero key support person for TAP now that Mr. Jaiwoba has moved on. So welcome, Liz, and we know you'll be a great resource for us, especially connecting transportation with planning. So I'm excited about that. So let's go ahead and I'll turn it over to Alicia.
Slide, please. We want to give you kind of an update of where we are with the Charlotte Future 2040 policy map. Next slide. Thank you. Highlights of some of the revisions that we have made to the first draft, and then talk a little bit about the community engagement activities that we have coming up, and then as well as talk about the fiscal analysis. I wanted to check if Matt Prosser was on the line, Donata. Okay, great. So Matt will talk about that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. I couldn't dare. But Matt will talk about a revision or an updated version of the fiscal impact analysis that was modeled for the second draft of the map, and we'll talk about next steps and schedule. Next slide, please. So just to level set and talk about what the policy map is, if there's three things you want to remember about this map and why it's important, it's a translation of the Charlotte Futures 2040's place-based policy, and what that simply is those policies within the comp plan. How do we map those on a map so we can use those to make land use, growth, and development decisions in the future? The other thing that the policy map does is also provide citywide direction for balancing our future needs and opportunities, looking through an equity lens, as well as understanding how growth happens in those areas where infrastructure capacity is available, or that we need to provide infrastructure in the future. And then also, how do we improve access to underserved areas in terms of housing opportunity, employment, and those types of things. The other thing that the policy map does is it provides us a new land use classification system called place types that looks beyond just one-dimensional, what is this land, how can this land be used, but it talks about the proportions of those land uses, how those different land uses can relate to each other, guidance on building form and design, as well as mobility, parking, and then how do we incorporate open space into our places as we grow as a community. So place types as a tool provides a more comprehensive and holistic approach to how we grow and develop in the future. Next slide, please. So many of you already know, definitely we sent out some notices about the second draft map was released on January 18th. It's available on our website at cltfuture.com, cltfuture2040.com. And there are two buttons to really, one, take you to the map directly, as before with previous drafts. You can see the map and then the place type designations. And then there's a second button on our website that's really easy to navigate to learn how to be engaged in our upcoming community engagement activities. Next slide. So this is a snapshot of what the map looks like. Key things to note about the map. One, the feature to provide comments is still the same as the first draft, so if you're navigating it for the second time, it's really easy to understand how to provide a comment, and that's the blue box on the left-hand corner. The second thing that's really important about the revised map is that we heard loud and clear from our elected officials and definitely from the community. How will we know what revisions were made? How will you know what the changes were from the first draft to the second draft? So the easiest way we could do that is to provide these large circles on the map, and then you can click on that circle and a box would appear that shows the evolution of the changes of the map. And then there's a layer, the third piece of information that's extremely important. At the top right-hand corner of the map, there's a menu that drops down, and there are additional layers of information that participants or viewer can see on the map in terms of historic districts. Where are those boundaries? In terms of future transit lines, where are those boundaries? And then there's also a feature where you can look specifically at the parcels that are being revised within the circles on the map as well. So that's just a quick overview of what the kind of key features are on the second draft of the map. Next slide. So again, this is just a reminder of the types of revisions. There are two big buckets of revisions that were made, technical and community driven, and quite honestly, all of them can be defined as community driven because they are a result of conversations that we've had with residents, our partners, and making some key revisions to reflect changes in our neighborhoods. How do we preserve our neighborhoods? How do we make sure that the parks and preserves are adequately preserved on the map as well, and some other changes that we made on the second revision. Next slide. So this slide illustrates kind of the breakdown amongst place types per version of the map. What key things to take away from this is that, one, the yellow and the orange are our neighborhoods. So predominantly we are preserving and making sure that we provide opportunities for our neighborhoods to thrive and grow over the future. The next thing to note, based on the revision and conversations that we've had, is the change in commercial, which is the red. We heard from quite a bit of feedback about how do we think about commercial in the future? How can we look at it more of a neighborhood center, more of walkable and more accessible type of commercial uses and less auto-oriented uses. Now we know there are auto-oriented uses that we have to have in our community, but how might we be more intentional with form, design, and placement of those in the future? The other thing to note is manufacturing, logistics, and innovation mixed use, the purple colors. Those are where typically our jobs are located, our job centers are located, how we provide those in the community. We're pretty consistent in making sure that we preserve those opportunities. The other thing to note as well on the map is the parks and preserves. That is the green color, and how we are making sure that we provide more open space and green space as we grow as a community as well. Next slide, please. So here is a schedule for the engagement window for phase 3. Again, we released the map on the 18th. This week we will have a series of listening sessions with residents or neighborhoods, whomever wants to sign up for a 30-minute one-on-one conversation with staff. They can sign up for that. And then in February, we will have live community conversations. That's a town hall style meeting. Some folks like that type of style of engagement so they can hear from others or their neighbors. And then we'll have a public comment session before council on the 14th. Next slide, please. So now I'll turn it over to Matt. Not sure if you want to take questions now or at the end, Madam Mayor Pro Tem.
let's take questions now just on the process, if that's okay.
Okay,
I do have one. Can you explain how the live community conversations are going to work?
So it's similar to the town halls, the virtual meetings that we've been having. Originally, we wanted to have in-person meetings, but with the rise in numbers, we decided that virtual meetings will be best for now. And so individuals can sign up at a noon or 6 p.m. meeting and participate in a conversation with staff after a short, brief presentation. In addition to the listening sessions where, say for instance, Billworth wanted to sign up, one person or the entire organization, they could, and then we'll have a conversation with them in a 30-minute one-on-one. So it's a small form and a large form is what we're offering for people to have dialogue about the matter.
Okay. And so everybody else can hear that conversation that's taking place between one party and staff? Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that's really important.
We'll record those and make sure they're available
Great.
on our
Okay.
website as well.
Any other questions? Okay, go ahead.
All right,
Alicia.
Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Yep. Thanks a lot. Good to be with you all again. I'm Matt Prosser with Economic Planning System. Go to the next slide. So, as you know, we're doing a number of economic analysis to support the policy map as well as the UDO. So, with each iteration of the place type map, we're running the projected growth by area through the fiscal impact model just to see what the results are, as well as sharing that information with other departments within the city and county to identify any potential areas where growth issues may need to be addressed or changes might need to be made to the place type map. Next slide. So as a reminder, we have 4 different analyses that are being completed as part of the fiscal impact analysis. We have the qualitative growth areas assessment questionnaire that has been sent out based on the most recent draft to different departments within the city and the county, and we are currently having meetings with those folks to identify any specific issues. We had a meeting with economic development this morning, actually, and have a follow-up with CDOT as well to make sure there aren't any issues and to document any growth concerns they have about different designations or areas that are forecasted to grow. We also, as I mentioned, have the ongoing fiscal impact model, which we're running the forecasted growth projections coming out of the community biz model through those fiscal impact models for both the city and the county, and are able to do revenue projections for special revenue funds and as well as evaluating the return on investment for certain. Next slide. This is just an overview, a reminder of the fiscal model, how we translate new jobs and new households into estimated revenues and expenditures for the city and the county, and that gives us a net fiscal impact number. Next slide. The community biz model is what we use to allocate countywide projections for new jobs and households within the city between 2020 and 2024 or 2040. And we use those outputs of new jobs by retail, office, industrial, and new housing units by single-family attached, multifamily stacked to run through the fiscal model. Next slide. And so one thing to point out, Alicia had shown you the allocation of land that was designated by each of the place types in her presentation, showing a couple things, the preservation of single-family or neighborhood 1 areas. We did increase the amount of manufacturing and logistics and also shifted some of the commercial area to more mixed-use place types such as community activity center and neighborhood center. The overall results of what we're seeing in terms of where jobs and households are projected to go is a shift towards more jobs and households within our mixed-use places, so our activity centers, as opposed to our single-use places, but still a significant capture of housing within sort of resident-only place types. When we look at the household chart on the left, in terms of new jobs, a greater capture of new jobs within our mixed-use places, but still a substantial amount of jobs going into our employment-only place types. an update on this latest iteration. We ran it through the fiscal impact model. Similar results to what we've found before. The 2040 draft 2040 map produces a net fiscal benefit for the city. It equates to about a 1.5% annual reduction in cost to serve for the city, which is a relatively small amount compared to the overall total budget for the city, but is beneficial. And the 2040 map is more beneficial than the adopted policy map. So we're created a land use pattern that appears to be at least somewhat more fiscally beneficial. So we will, I think, next slide. Oh, never mind. I'll go back to that one. We will be finalizing our fiscal impact analysis after the last draft is created and the model, the map is run through the community biz model again, and we'll be creating a final fiscal impact analysis. Within that, we'll be documenting some of that feedback we're getting from our interdepartmental partners in the city and county, and highlighting any changes or outcomes related to that. And so we will share those with you all again in a future form. So with that, I'll take any questions, but also I'll turn it over to Alicia to talk through the schedule for the rest of the month.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and take a couple questions first. Thanks, Matt. Mr. Eggleston
Yep.
has a question.
Sure. Thank you. In the financial analysis, the $3 million difference, there's only two categories that are changed from the status quo map to the 2040 map, and it looks like an overwhelming majority of the savings come from fire. I'm just curious how it was determined that, I mean, I'm glad to see it. I'm just curious how we got to a conclusion that we save money on fire, but not, for instance, policing, and certainly, well, I'm just picturing an environment where we are going to be more built out with more people to serve, more buildings to monitor, albeit newer buildings are better equipped to deter or suppress fire. But why did we think that all of a sudden we're going to get a huge savings there, but not really anywhere else?
A couple things. So in terms of police service, the relationship of new growth to the cost of police service is pretty linear in terms of new jobs or new households generally just equal more additional costs. The pattern in our work with the police department, the location of growth did not significantly impact the cost that for providing police protection. There will obviously be the need for increased police services. We actually have some comments from them about the growth maps that we're going to discuss with them. Specifically is that, we're modeling costs off current levels of service that are provided by the police department. And assuming those levels of service are sufficient and adequate in 20 years from now, and that, there's a question of whether current levels of service for police services are at a place where they would like them to be. And so that's more of a question of sort of the budgeting process and allocation of resources that you all do annually, and less sort of impacted on the pattern, if that's that makes sense.
I'm just envisioning that as the city continues to grow with people and additional housing and jobs and things like that are going to attract more people, that there is an associated need for increased headcount in both police and fire to serve that amount of people. And I assume they both have some sort of best practice ratio for the number of officers or firefighters relative to our population. So I hope the projection is right. It just seems curious to me.
Yeah, so we have estimates for, I believe we have estimates for high-level estimates of increase of personnel that we've built, and we can document those in the final fiscal impact analysis. And we can talk to police about sort of comparing those to your point, your standard sort of target levels of service or staffing levels. I think our main point is that we don't think the pattern of growth necessarily is going to impact their costs or the amount of growth that will occur, which is
Okay, I appreciate it. And we can talk more offline, but I'd be interested to see a breakdown of that 34.8 to 34 or 32.1 fire calculation.
Yeah, and we can do that. And there's, obviously it's very complicated, and fire service is impacted not only by the density of development, but also significantly by the location, and also the road network that provides service to it. Their main two metrics are really response times to fire calls, and then utilization of fire personnel. And what we found is some of the lower density place types, say neighborhood 1, generate a higher cost per call or cost per call for service than other place types, due partly to their transportation network and the geography that a single fire station can cover, based on that road network and the density of development in that fire station area.
That's it.
Thank you. Any other questions from our online participants? Oh, I'm sorry.
Madam Chair, it's Ed.
Yes, and I'm sorry, Mr. Winston was in line first, Mr. Driggs, and then I'll get to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to comment exactly what a bit on what Mr. Prosser said. Mr. Eggleston, I mean, more people does not necessarily equate to the need for more police or more fire. Density is a big key, right? When you have suburban sprawl and you have single family, for instance, neighborhoods on the outreaches of towns, it costs a lot more money to spend on getting water out there, fire vehicles, for instance. It takes a lot more manpower, and that has fiscal impact. When you go vertical, you can add a lot more people, but still, utilizing less infrastructure to deal with certain emergency services, and that that has real costs. I would say that as we build more dense, it will be important to talk to our folks over at the county and some of their building standards, and talking with a lot of folks over at Charlotte Fire Department. One of the things that they mention is that these new apartments and apartment buildings are burning hotter and faster. So I think that's something that we need to be cognizant of, and figure out if we are building into these fiscal models, things like that. We need to make sure that is actually true in the building standards that are happening in the county. On top of that, we are looking at many different law enforcement type models that are more fiscally sound. We saw that in CMPD's report this year. For instance, as CMPD has to take different models, for instance, for traffic enforcement and traffic control in dense urban areas. We're looking to different models that reduce the per capita costs to make that happen. So, I definitely, I imagine this is a pretty complex equation, but I just think it would be disingenuous and a bit dangerous to equate directly the increase of people to the need for more police and fire when it's much more complex than that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Driggs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's worth emphasizing for the benefit of anybody who might be watching that we are not conducting our 2040 process or our policy map or any of those things with an eye towards increasing city revenues. So we need to monitor these numbers in order to be aware of what the implications might be, but this is not what it's about. I'm just afraid some people could look at this and think that we're sitting here calculating how much more money we will have as a result of doing all of this. And of course, the stakes are much higher than that. Matt, I had a question for you. this shows a $3 million difference. Now, is that an annual difference? And if so, from when to when? Or, how do we apply that number?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this is an annual number at 2040. And so we can go back and give an estimate over 20 years what we think the potential cost savings would be.
So,
yeah, this is a reflection of 2040 state difference.
Right. Now, I'm assuming that by 2040, our general fund is going to be on the order of $1 billion or something like that. So I think we also need to emphasize that these differences are really pretty insignificant in the context of the overall budget. And I'm not sure that a modeling exercise like this actually has the kind of resolution that could pinpoint the $3 million difference. So I appreciate the work you're doing, and I think we can draw some conclusions from it. But we also need to be a little bit careful with the interpretation, given the difficulty of this kind of forecasting and the level of precision that can be achieved. And that's why, in particular, when I see 25% greater benefit, to me, that overstates our ability to resolve what that difference is and the magnitude of the difference. It gives the impression of a much greater impact than the numbers actually support. So I do want us to be careful about using this data productively. What I did find interesting in what you said, Matt, was the point about job creation and so on. So those are the kind of things that we really want to know more about. So I think if we can interpret the implications of our plan in terms of how many more jobs will we create, what will the impact be on our economy, and other kind of observable social changes that emanate from it, that's the kind of information that is really important to us as we finalize these plans. So I was curious, I don't know if there's a simple answer to this question, but how do you impute changes in jobs from the maps? Like, what is the process? Do you look at the way the policy map changes the allocation of land among different uses and derive something from that? Or is there anything general you can say about that?
Yeah, so every parcel in the city is analyzed to identify if it's developable, whether it's vacant or if it's it can be likely to be redeveloped, I would say. And then based on its site attributes, it's given a sort of probability score in the community viz model. And then what we do is we overlay the place type designations, both in the status quo and in the 2040 map, over all of the parcels. And the model is able to identify the parcels that are most likely to develop, and then assigns it allocates jobs or households to different place types based on the parameters of this place type. So it gives us a sense of whether or not we're able to accommodate the types of industrial jobs, per se, in the places that we are planning for. And so the conversation we had with Economic Development Department this morning was talking about making sure the areas that you all have identified as priority of employment growth areas are being reflected correctly in the map, both from a place type designation standpoint, but also from what the model estimates the probability of development occurring there is. And so making sure there's alignment in our designation, but also the underlying estimates of growth for each sub-geography in the city, so that as all departments are doing capital planning and future planning, they're working off a data set that is accurately reflecting not only what's likely in the market, but what the efforts from economic development and others are to entice growth in certain areas.
I think it would be great to shine a brighter light, if you will, on some of those things and
Yep.
what we can infer from jobs and stuff, and not give the impression that our main interest here is about whether we end up with $3 million advantage in 20 years or how many years in our budget. And I think when we get the economic impact analysis that is being done, this modeling exercise and stuff like that, it'll be interesting to see how that lines up with some of the conclusions that we're seeing here. I would also say just about the conversation on police and stuff, I think it's fair to call this a static model as opposed to a dynamic model, right, Matt? So
that's fair.
what we're doing here is we are extrapolating and noticing certain increments, but we're not considering how some of the changes we observe might affect the other variables in the model, which, by the way, would be a Herculean task. I'm not suggesting you should have done that. Very difficult to do, but there are limitations to a static model, and that's another reason that I'm a little cautious about interpreting these results. I think it's useful to have this information, but we shouldn't kind of, read down to $716 versus 106 and think that that's something that's important to us. But thank you for your work, Matt. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. I have a question for Alicia and the team. With the proposed adoption schedule, the next recommended policy map release on the 21st, what happens if there's other recommended changes? Because I know there's a lot that's come back, but if that next map comes out and people are still not ready to accept what's been recommended change since the 18th, and then we go right into 7 days later, a request for adoption by the council, I'm a little bit concerned about that time frame, honestly, especially because we're also really digging into the UDO right now, and we're finding that it's hard to explain it to folks, but there are changes that could come in the UDO that would speak to the policy map. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why we wouldn't have the policy map approved a little bit closer to the time of the UDO, and maybe Allison can speak to that. I don't know who the best is, but I guess what I'm saying is, while we're still really churning through the UDO and trying to absorb what it's telling us, that could inform changes on the policy map. But we've got a date of February 28th, which is pretty soon, and only one map released until then. And then we go all the way till July. What happens between February 28th and July if we really feel there's some necessary changes that could inform the map?
Sure, Lisa, if you want to start with the process on the map side, and then I'll tackle the UDO piece. Next. Oh. So while she's pulling up the slide with the schedule on it, so what happens is the public comment period for the second draft of the map ends on the 4th. That gives staff time to process and revise the map based on the feedback. Then the final draft, which after public comment happens on the 14th, that starts the review and adoption process with council and planning committee. And so then the map is before you all, and any changes at that point would be at a recommendation by council or planning committee. After the
28th?
Yeah, after the 14th.
After the 14th.
Yes.
So, I'm sorry, the public comment period ends on the 4th?
Yes.
On the 4th.
Yes. That gives us time to make revisions based on what we've heard, because it is not just changing the colors on the map. We have to do some analysis, run the models, make sure it all works. And so then that final draft is released on the 21st, that final recommended draft. So if there are comments beyond that point or suggested revisions, then we could make those before adoption. It is up to you. This is the schedule that we've outlined based on the project schedule that we originally had and set at the beginning of the project. But if we think that there's more time that needs to be had between the final recommended draft and council adoption, we could entertain that schedule, come back with options from you all.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, not the fear, but The reasoning for adopting the policy map before the UDO is to establish the vision or the policy first that guides how the UDO, the districts will be mapped in the future. The inverse, I'm not sure how that would work if the UDO, if there's modifications from the UDO. I don't think that those implications are the same. Alice can speak to that. But
Yeah.
once we adopt the policy map, our direction is, as staff, is to begin thinking about the area planning process, how that works and how that will work moving forward. So while the UDO process is moving forward, if that makes sense.
And so the UDO will point to what the particular place type is for certain elements of like dimensional standards and things like that. There are places which you say, if you are this place type, then this is how the UDO will then apply to that particular parcel. So the place type map has to be adopted, or the policy map has to be adopted before the UDO can be fully implemented.
Yes, I can understand that. I'm just a little bit concerned about getting through all of this in February, and then we have all that time from February till July.
That's not a lot of time.
Mr.
Yeah.
Eggleston?
Either what I thought the Mayor Pro Tem was saying, or just my own thoughts if I misinterpreted what she said, but I don't think she was saying she doesn't. I think we understand why the map comes before the UDO. I think she's just talking about, does it need to be 5 months in advance of the UDO? And this timeline assumes that the next version of the policy map that comes out is going to be pretty close to completely right. And I think we've heard from folks in the community that there have been a lot of what they view as mistakes of the first draft that have been corrected in the second draft, but they are still identifying things where they think there's not alignment in terms of specific place types. So I assume the next version will be again greatly improved, but I think it is a little risky to assume that it's going to be, and it'll never be perfect. So I'm not saying that's what we have to wait for, but I think that it's a little dangerous to assume that the next version is not going to have things we still need to take a hard look at, and 1 day for the planning commission to look at it and 7 days for the council to look at it might be a bit ambitious.
So,
And I don't think we want to be, I mean, you said there's opportunity for council changes, but I don't know that would be the right time to do that.
right, because it's very technical, and I think the expectation that we've gotten from the community, and granted, it makes perfect sense that they want to have those granular conversations about this parcel, that parcel, and that parcel. That's why we wanted to bake in time to start the area planning process, to get it ready between the adoption of the map and when the UDO is adopted in July. So this fall, we can start having those types of conversations. This is a citywide map that's mapped at the block level, and it's a methodology. If we change something in one neighborhood, it changes something in the other neighborhood. It's the systems approach to mapping it, just to level the playing field on the policy. Those granular conversations that I know the neighborhoods want will happen during the area planning process, where we can talk more about land uses specific to a parcel and how it relates to transportation in that neighborhood or within that area. It's hard to do that on a citywide level and do it equitably. Let's say that part. But what I can say is from each version of the map. So we had about 1,000 or so comments the first draft. The second draft, we have 153 so far. And of those comments that we received, most of them have been resolved. A third of them are newer comments. So they're not comments that people are repeating within those areas of change. So we've relatively addressed most of those concerns. So again, to your point, it won't be perfect, but how do we address the larger issues, transitions to the neighborhoods, making sure that we are addressing our corridors of opportunity, applying job growth in the areas where we know we want it, recognizing our major infrastructure investments along, like the Silver Line. How are we getting those big pieces right? And then those granular conversations will happen during the area planning process. The more we delay that, the longer it'll take. We're looking at next year before we can even start an area plan if we keep pushing the policy map down.
Yeah, that all makes sense.
Yeah.
And I'm not proposing that we put off adopting the policy map for months, I think, but I would like to be counted as a second vote in the column of, I don't think 7 days between the next draft and council adoption is going to be sufficient. Maybe that's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Again, I'm not trying to push it into the summer, but I think we need more than 7 days for the community and the council, and probably more than 1 day for the planning commission to be able to really sink their teeth into that next and close to final draft.
I think too, a lot will, when we start to have those community conversations that are scheduled, and understanding some of the feedback, I think that will really help inform whether we need to make a schedule change or not. So I think that will be helpful in those discussions for sure.
Okay, yeah, I think that really helps to explain the area plans and why you need the 5 months, what takes place at that time. How many area plans are there?
So there are 15 planning geographies that we're proposing. What we will have to decide is priority based on some analysis where are areas of greatest need and opportunities. And we'll use the metrics and measures from the comp plan to help us to create that list. We haven't created the process. We know it won't be one area plan at a time, but how do we group similar planning geographies together and do them in a series, like we've done with the transit station area plans. We've done it before, and that's how we're envisioning doing it this fall, if we can start this fall. We're also creating a community planning toolbox. So as those communities that are ripe for an area plan, while they're waiting, they have a toolbox to help them get ready for that plan. That could be identifying issues and opportunities within the area, establishing their vision, some of those things that could make them ready when we approach them for a plan. They've already decided some of these things amongst themselves. We've seen neighborhoods like NODA do that. On the West End, they've done it. So different parts of the community have started their own visioning, but how do we create a toolbox for every neighborhood in the community to use to do a similar exercise?
So my last question, then I'll move to our two council members online. Just as an illustrative example, if you've got, after the 28th, if the map has been adopted, and a neighborhood group comes to us and says, through those conversations, we really need to get this area or a number of parcels remapped to a different place type, what would even be the process for that? How would if they came to me, I would have to say, I don't know, because it's not a rezoning, right? They can't do a rezoning. How would they even?
So it's similar to how area plans have worked in the past, where what typically happens is staff or community, the two ways that a plan can happen. A neighborhood can request one, or staff has done some analysis to determine that an area plan needs to happen. And so that process is typically we create a list of plans or areas that need a plan, and then bring that recommendation before council to say, here are the area plans we're going to take, or here's our process for doing that. A change in a place type doesn't necessarily trigger an area plan per se. If someone's developing a piece of property, then that would be, the question would be, one, what is the current zoning? If they want to do a change in zoning, that would be the typical rezoning process as well. And then the place type change would be considered that way. But just to change a place type because someone doesn't like it, there has to be a conversation as to why the change is needed. Why isn't it consistent in their view? that's a conversation first and foremost. That may not even trigger a whole process for an area plan, so to speak.
Got it, but it is possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Who do we have first? Mr. Winston.
Yeah, just two comments. Just one for the public out there. In regards to Mr. Driggs' comments, he's correct that the 2040 plan was not meant to increase revenue, but fiscal activity. The reason this fiscal analysis was done was because this was a specific request of council. It was definitely a huge sticking point during the discussions and was part of one of those straw votes that the council took to send staff on this effort. So that is why the fiscal analysis is happening and why we're kind of analyzing this data. And just to staff, to Ms. Eiselt's questions, I think it might be a good thing when we present this to council and just to have to create sort of a flow chart of this planning approach, which is kind of the central kind of paradigm for the Comp 2040 plan. This is the difference of changing from a kind of deal-making approach to a planned approach. So you start with that 2040 plan, then you go to the place types mapping, those small area plans, which will be about 15 of them, and those even smaller specific plans for neighborhoods. So I think that'll be good for future councils, or this council, future councils, and the community to really kind of drive in what this planning approach really does mean and how do we operate in it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Driggs?
Yes, and to Mr. Winston's point, I believe for myself, speaking for myself at least, what we were asking for was economic impact and not fiscal impact. And I think that got garbled in the conversation a little bit. There's a big difference, and I think what was on the minds of a lot of people who said there is something missing was the economic impact piece and not the fiscal impact piece. So again, the fiscal impact is useful as a reference. Economic impact is important and different, and we're still waiting to see that. I just wanted to say on the further to what my colleagues have said, I think in the minds of a layperson, certainly this one, the UDO and the policy map are not sort of separate. So it's hard to understand how you can adopt a policy map while the UDO is still very much in the works, because you assume that they somehow complement each other and that they need to be coordinated with each other. And therefore, to be able to lock in a policy map while your UDO is still being negotiated and evolving. And that's why I think the suggestion was that for one, we give ourselves a little more time on the policy map, and two, that we achieve a convergence of these two rather than adoption of one and then 5 months later finalizing the other. And I still think that the policy map should be reflected in the UDO and vice versa. They are opposite sides of the same coin, it seems to me. And maybe that's just, if you're not a planner, you don't get it. But that's, I think, the view that is behind these suggestions about why we 5 months apart in these adoptions. But what I'll also say is I think the policy map, frankly, is very difficult to assess. I don't care whether I have a week or a month or how long. I can't sit there and look at that map and sort of detect all of the issues that are likely to emerge as we move forward and discover and practice what the implications are, and as the various locations discover and practice what this map means for them. So I think we're going to find out a lot about what the community thinks and what we think about the policy map as we get further down the road and it starts to become apparent. And I will mention our last zoning meeting where we had the controversial NODA rezoning and the one in my district in Ardrey Hill. People were pointing to the 2040 plan and they were starting to invoke some of our thinking to justify very high density development. And in one case, I think more legitimately than the other. But the important thing for me in all of this is not really the adoption date of the plan, the map, but what our process is going to be going forward to kind of respond on an ongoing basis to things that emerge or become apparent. Because I really don't think that we're going to know the final word on this map and on our UDO until people start to see how it works in practice. And so my biggest concern, and I think Mayor Pro Tem kind of alluded to this, is what kind of flexibility do we have? We don't want to be locked into something that is inflexible based on the limited amount of understanding that we're able to gain right now about the policy map, talking in the abstract. Members of the community aren't watching. They may look and see what happens in their own neighborhood, but it's very hard to get the larger community to participate in a policy conversation like this. It's too complicated, and therefore the opinions we get are probably driven by one of the other neighborhood's concerns. And so I think it's critical that as we go forward, we do have a mechanism that allows us to respond to issues that become apparent as we get closer to this and as we get down into more specific and as we finalize the UDO. And I don't want to be fighting all the time against a policy map that we put in place in a couple of weeks based on what we know now, when later on we start to recognize much better and all kinds of voices that haven't been heard yet start to speak about what this means. So I just hope that we will have a good process for updating, modifying, continuing to improve the policy map as our UDO process continues, and then going into the area plan adoption. And I'm kind of interested in the area plan idea because my impression from earlier conversations was the place types were the successors to area plans. So we basically would not have area plans because we now have place types. So I'm interested that we will, in fact, now also have area plans, and I'm wondering what is the area plan? How is the area plan different from place types? I thought place types were the ones that defined, what the geography should look like, and now we have an overlay of a different kind of description of what the geography is meant to look like. So I'm interested to know how that works.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. Go ahead. So, Mr. Driggs, the place type is a new land use classification system. So it takes what we used to call just residential, commercial, mixed use, light industrial, heavy industrial. It takes it and provides a more holistic approach to looking at how land use interacts with each other and how you think broadly about mobility and parking and green space, all of that within one classification system. So for example, if you're talking about N1, the residential neighborhood, it doesn't only just talk about a single family home or a type of single family structure. It also talks about other uses that are compatible within that place type. It also gives guidance on the type of mobility that should happen in that place type, open space where parking is likely to happen, and how that place type in and of itself relates to other place types. So our current system doesn't do that. Place types is the tool that will do that. The area plan looks at a collection of places or communities or neighborhoods and talks about and identifies issues or opportunities that may trigger or may not a change in a place type designation. Or it may, like the West Boulevard Playbook, talk more about economic development opportunity within that area. Say there's displacement happening within a neighborhood, what types of tools do we need to look at, and is an area plan the right tool to do that? And so that's the difference, or how the place type or policy map will be used in that type of process. How the place types will say, or the policy map will be used as guidance on how to use that land particularly, and then what are the issues or other things that we need to address on a holistic analysis will be happening in an area plan type of process. And so there may be modifications to the policy map based on an area plan. There may be recommendations for a different zoning to implement that place type change. So it doesn't function differently than what we have today. It's just a more efficient way of looking at how we plan for growth and development, if that makes sense. We're also looking at go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm looking at it in the context of how we work today, right? So on a Monday night, once a month, we look at a 1 acre parcel. And we say, okay, we're going to change that from an R3 to an R8. Are place types that granular, or are place types larger areas than that?
So you will be, each parcel has a place type designation. So in order to make that decision about the zoning, you would look to the policy map to see what the place type designation is as to how, what's the direction or guidance for the future use of that parcel. So you will use a policy map similarly as you would the current adopted future land use map. That doesn't change.
Okay. So the policy map is as granular as our current system of zoning assignments. Again, 1 acre here, a half an acre, 20 acres. Is it really equivalent to the zoning categories that we have assigned today? And then the area plan will have the same purpose that area plans do now, of stating a kind of broader aspiration for a larger area. I just thought the place types replaced the area plans, and so that's why I'm, if they don't replace the area plans, they then replace the zoning categories that we have now. And
So-
again, down to that.
Because staff is just giving staff answers, and it's confusing, and it's not. Every place type has allowable zoning districts, so no, it's not as granular. So in each place type, there might be single-family residential zoning. There might be other types of zoning districts that are allowed in each place type. But the place type will govern the type of growth and development patterns we want to see, but they will allow many different zoning districts within each place type. So it is not as granular as you would say. But you might run into a situation at some point in time where the place type that we set today, in 10 years, we might want a different zoning district that is not allowable in that place type. So we would have to look at changing that place type. So you can change different zoning districts within said place type without changing that place type.
Mr. Winston, according to the way this has been described to us, there are no zoning districts. In other words,
That's not true.
Yeah, okay, hey, guys.
The zoning
Hey, guys.
I'd like to talk to staff, Mr. Winston.
Let's
because,
just-
they're the ones offering this.
Let's just have-
As it stands right now, a particular location is an R3. And the way it's proposed, that's going to be an N1, if I understand this right. There is no such thing as R this or in any of those old zoning categories. Now, the designation for any location will be a place type, and that will define what can happen at that location. Is that wrong?
Go
Okay.
ahead, Alicia,
Okay,
please, Ms.
all right.
Osborne.
So let's take it back to the basics. So you have policy, and then you have a regulatory tool, which is zoning. What we are talking about with the place types is the policy part. The way place types works in its application, Councilmember Winston is partly right. It's applied on a block by block basis. So that means that one block will have, or 2 blocks or collection of blocks will have a particular place type. But within that blocks, there are parcels. Therefore, each parcel will have a place type designation. That's the policy. To implement that policy or that vision, you have the zoning, which is the UDO. And what we've heard from you all and in the community, how do we make sure that our regulatory tool within the zoning districts relate to the vision, which is our place type? So you have N1 place types, as an example, neighborhood 1, where residential and possibly some other uses like a park or school may be allowed within that neighborhood designation, which is the policy. There are specific zoning districts that implement that vision within that policy. So you have different in 1, A, B, or C, or those different districts. So they relate to each other. So every parcel has a place type designation or something that says, here's what this parcel should be used for in the future. And it will also have a zoning district that correlates to implementing that from the regulatory side. Does that help?
Yes, I think I would just say that the concepts you described and the goals that we've established make sense to me. And
Okay.
but they're still very general. You know, we want mobility, we want these things to be reflected and so on. And the point I'm trying to make is we need to find out more about how this works in practice and not be tied down too much by decisions we made as we learn from experience and from, you know, further conversations. What exactly does that mean? You know, at this location, if you want to build something, you must put this sidewalk there, or you can't do that unless you're this close. I mean, I just don't know, based on everything that we've been hearing for years, frankly, how does this play out? What does it mean? And as we learn more about how it works, I'm really concerned that we have to have the ability not to be tied down by decisions we made now. And if we can agree on that, I would say let's go ahead and adopt the policy map, because we've probably come as far as we're going to at this level in terms of identifying issues with the map or improving it. So sure, let's go ahead and put it in place, but let's understand that it's going to take time, and we're going to go through for the next year or two this area plan process and all these other steps, and we're going to be learning through the early rezonings that get done under the UDO where the issues are, unintended consequences or costs. What are the implications for the affordability of housing as a result of all of these things that we're trying to do? So we just have to have a certain kind of transition or dynamic process that doesn't tie us down too much based on something that we put in place today.
Mr. Dries, you're absolutely right. I would say the best example that we have today as how the place types and the zoning works is our transit-oriented development districts. At the beginning of trying to revise those and refine them to where they are today, they were done in a way, the process was to model what we would do with the policy map and the UDO. So you have the transit-oriented plans with TOD, the nice little colorful map that shows the intensity closer to the station, and as you go out, how that should be, and there are different land use or place type designations for those. Then there's the UDO or the zoning districts that help to implement that vision. And there's a suite of districts for that allow you to implement the place types around the transit station, the transit-oriented development around the station. So that's the best example that we have. And again, those opportunities to revise, to amend, and to change as we grow are embedded with how we do business today. We're not saying that those things go away. You still have a way to amend the process or the policies moving forward in a similar fashion. So the example of how TOD works would be similar to what we're trying to do on the citywide basis with the place type map, policy map.
Okay, I think that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, could I contribute one thing really fast? This is Jay Rankins with MIG.
Oh, hi, Jay. Welcome. Go ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to point out that the implementation strategy of the comprehensive plan, which is part 2, section 9 actually outlines not just amending the policy map, but a process for updating the plan itself. So there is generally a 6-month cycle envisioned to look at inconsistencies that might come up because of community area planning, to Councilman Driggs' point about, lessons learned and, maybe some of these unintended consequences of different mapping or implementation of that mapping through the UDO and the regulatory process, that there is a sort of baked-in process of learning and updating the map, just doing that systematically.
Okay, I think that's helpful, Jay and Alicia. I appreciate that, because that's really what we have the most concern about. No matter where you stand on the comprehensive plan or whatever, as council members, I think it's fair to say that in my almost 7 years, this is the most complicated thing we've ever done. And you all, this is your business. This is what you do, and you understand the technicalities of it. But we as council members don't necessarily. So as we are, and we continue to be informed by the public. So I do appreciate the flexibility that will be built into this, and I think that's an important point to communicate to people. So I appreciate that. And that's the first I've really heard about the area plans, so I'm guessing it is for other council members as well, so we'll want to know more about that. But with that, we'll close that out and move on to our next topic, if we're all good. The next topic is our strategic mobility plan, and we'll have Ed McKinney from CDOT to present. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, Ed McKinney with the Charlotte Department of Transportation. What we'd like to do this morning is just give you a quick update on all the process and activity going on with the strategic mobility plan, give you a sense of the overall schedule, give you a little bit of an update and some more detail on that, give you a little snapshot of what has been going on, just some of the highlights of things we've been doing from a community engagement standpoint, and then probably primarily what we want to do today is just give you a forecast of what the level of conversation we want to be having with this committee and with council over the next couple of months, and just really talk about next steps as we go through that process. So if you go to the next slide, this will look, should be, go back, there we go, yep. So you've seen this slide before. I just want to use this again just to put some of this in context. We just had a good conversation, detailed conversation about the policy map process. So I want to put the strategic mobility plan into some of that context. So we've talked about this before. These three things, the policy map, the mobility plan, and the unified development ordinance, as we've talked about, are really important parts of the implementation of the overall comprehensive plan. For us, the strategic mobility plan is sort of the primary mobility piece between those two things, the policy of our vision and the implementation, as Alicia just talked about, of the unified development ordinance. We've talked also about some very specific things that are coming from that strategic mobility plan called the Streets Manual, both the Streets Map and the Comprehensive Transportation Review Guidelines. Again, lots of detail, that some of which we've talked with this committee and the council before. I want to emphasize it in this diagram because it's important to remember the connection between these mobility efforts from this policy that we've been talking about, from the policy map, and the implementation through our ordinance in the Unified Development Ordinance. The couple examples that I've got here, as we've talked about before, we want to talk certainly more about with this committee, is the Streets Map, which is a document that we were creating citywide that sort of identifies our expectations around transportation investment on our major arterial corridors. That's reflective of and has been part of the process that we have been working on with planning relative to the policy map. So we certainly want to make sure that that Streets Map reflects the vision of that, the emerging vision of that policy map. But it's also, once documented, that Streets Map will have a specific tie to requirements in the Unified Development Ordinance. So it's a really important link between the broader policy and the way we're going to implement. So when you're down to a zoning district, the type of street you're on will have a really important connection to what we expect you to do relative to rules in that Unified Development Ordinance. The other aspect of that we've talked about, and again, don't want to go in detail, but just want to remind you about it, is this Comprehensive Transportation Review Guidelines. It's a long way of talking about our traffic impact study, the way we look at development as it comes in. both through the rezoning process and by right development. How do we analyze and measure that impact? How do we define the process by which we define the expectations of development to provide infrastructure for development? We, again, as we've talked about with you, believe this is a great time for us to think about that more holistically, make sure it supports the goals of our comprehensive plan and our vision, and is then, again, a really important technical way that through the Unified Development Ordinance will actually sort of wire those expectations ultimately in the definition of our ordinance. So again, context of that from a mobility standpoint, the streets manual, the two things I just talked about are some very detailed things we have begun to talk with you about, but we want to spend the next couple of months spending a lot more time and walking through some of the details of those things as we go through and anticipate getting those policy initiatives adopted as part of these larger initiatives relative to the comprehensive plan. Go to the next slide. So just to give you the context of the schedule. Again, you've seen this version of this schedule before. What we've done now is I just want to focus on the middle bar here. You can see the policy map and the Unified Development Ordinance schedule on both the top and the bottom, but what we really want to talk about is just, again, emphasize how we've been coordinating that schedule relative to these other initiatives, both the policy map and the UDO. Back in the fall, so the sort of concurrent to the release of the first draft of the Unified Development Ordinance and the first draft of the policy map, we released some of the technical details of that manual that I just talked about. So the streets map and the comprehensive transportation review guidelines have been out. I'll talk a little bit about what that process and the engagement has looked like over the last couple of months. But again, I want to emphasize that it was important that we put and did that work sort of concurrent to these other efforts, the policy map and the UDO, because of that relationship I just talked about. We wanted those out there and being reviewed and going through a public process sort of concurrent to both the Unified Development Ordinance and the policy map. Our longer term schedule, so you look out on that bar, our anticipation that is in the early part of April, we want to put all of that back together, do sort of a full release of the complete strategic mobility plan, which would also include updates and kind of the next iteration and refinement of the streets manual document I just talked about, with the goal of a process then of review and draft, ultimately a public hearing, and an anticipated council adoption of that work in June. And again, the timeline there is really to sort of be concurrent and kind of following the importance of both the ultimate adoption of the UDO, because there's several pieces of this that are important to the longer term implementation of the UDO, but it also allows us to continue to follow the policy map process and ensure that we have the ability to kind of update and have that work refined and reflective of where ultimately council lands on the policy map and the adoption of that policy document from a citywide perspective. Next slide. So that's the schedule. Let me just give you a snapshot of some of the things we've been doing just from a community engagement standpoint. I'm going to be really specific. We've done a number of other things. We want to come back to you in the next couple of months to share more of that. But I want to just talk briefly about both the streets map and the comprehensive transportation review and some of the engagement we have done. As I mentioned, that work, again, a first draft of all of that work was released back in fall. We've had an online map for the streets map out since October. We sort of partnered with planning with a number of the community virtual and in-person meetings they had relative to the policy map, got some good input through that and just exposure in terms of getting the streets map, getting awareness of that streets map out in the public. So we certainly received lots of good, just like the policy map did. We've received lots of good, very specific, hundreds of comments about kind of what that map was saying, lots of good questions and lots of good things that we needed to review. And so we're still in the process of sort of assessing, reviewing, and kind of analyzing those comments with the notion of we want to, again, come back later in the spring with a sort of an update of that map. Similarly, with the comprehensive transportation review guidelines, which it's a lot more of a technical thing, is again, you recall from some of our discussions, really relates to the development process. So we've in the development of that work, we've gone through some very specific stakeholder discussions with some of the the engineers and the sort of the specific consultants and organizations and developers that do that work, just to kind of understand the technical piece. And then with the draft, we've been out there also just talking to other organizations broadly, and both community organizations and sort of development industry organizations, again, just to raise awareness about what we're trying to do, get some initial feedback and some input as we go through the kind of review and discussion about what those recommendations are proposing. The last thing I'll say there, this is again an ongoing thing and a really important part of the coordination we're doing with planning on the economic impact analysis that's happening relative to the UDO. So these guidelines, the draft guidelines that we put out there, are part of the ongoing coordination and discussion that planning is having with the economic impact analysis of the overall UDO. So we recognize clearly that if we're wanting to understand the economic impact of the ordinance itself, these guidelines, which really are a support piece to that, are as important, particularly around transportation investment. So I just want to emphasize there that we've really made sure that work is integrated to that discussion. Once that concludes, we'll be able to come back to the committee and the council about what is that telling us, and it'll give us some good sort of feedback and understanding about, are there some things we need to make sure are consistent both with the policy we're trying to implement with the ordinance, and then find and identify the areas that we think might be need some adjustment just relative to the kind of the economic impact that some of these ordinances are proposing. So that just a little quick snapshot on those two specific things. Again, I'll just want to mention that there's lots of other overall engagement work we've been doing on the broader policy, and we really like to come back and talk with you in the next couple of months about what that looks like and some of the additional engagement we're going to be doing as we build up to the release of the broader mobility plan later this spring. If you go to the next slide, I just want to, again, lay out, now I want to really just focus on kind of the discussion we want to have with this committee and with council over the next couple of months. This just outlines the three big areas of things that we want to come back and have some more detailed discussion with you on. First one is the policy, the strategic mobility plan overall. This is an aspect we probably really haven't spent much time with you yet in detail, but is probably one of the more important things, and that would be something we want to come back with you in the next couple of months, talking about the draft policies, the kind of priority recommendations about where we think capital investment should be prioritized and focused. What we've been doing is gathering and building upon the work of the comprehensive plan, the policy map, and using that to help us frame what are the right policies from a mobility standpoint that we should put forward to council to help us implement the vision of this comprehensive plan. So what does it mean essentially from a mobility standpoint, and how would it affect our prioritization for public investment and essentially our mobility policy? So albeit we have not had that level of discussion with you yet, that's one of the things we want to work on and come back and get some good dialogue about where we think we need to go from a policy standpoint. The two others are the things I've just mentioned. Again, is certainly the streets map. We've got lots of good feedback. We want to come back, share with you what we're hearing, talk with you about the revisions and sort of the tool that streets map is, and how we're responding to the community feedback on that to give you a sense of what that next iteration of that map looks like. And similarly with the comprehensive transportation review, lots of work going on that we want to again share with you. And certainly we've only sort of introduced the basic idea to council and to this committee, so we certainly believe there's the need for some additional conversation with you over the next couple of months. Last slide, just to give you a more specific sense. Essentially that means over the next, between now and June, we will be in front of this, we hope to be in front of this committee monthly to talk in more detail about some of the topics I just mentioned. So literally every month between essentially now and the end of May, we really need some time to have this kind of dialogue with the committee. We also believe we've kind of targeted both in March and in May the sort of good time frame for us to then have a more sort of a complete council discussion at a strategy session. So we anticipate the discussions we've been having with this committee would help us then shape some strategic time to be talking with the full council about where we're going with this plan and get some full council feedback and dialogue. we anticipate, again, our schedule is to put a release of that first draft of the mobility plan, again, with a second draft of that manual in early April. And then ultimately, our schedule is to come back into June with a public, final public hearing after draft and iteration, and a final public and council adoption at the end of June. With the goal of that allows us to be sort of timed well to the ultimate decision you'll be having related to the Unified Development Ordinance. So laid out a lot there. Just again, most of that is a reminder about what we've done and what we've talked about with you before, a little bit more detail on kind of the schedule and giving you some anticipation of the kind of the amount of dialogue and discussion we want to be having with this committee over the next several months.
Thank you, Ed. I wonder, when you come back in February, can you maybe have prepared for us a live illustration of this? It might be, like Parkwood might be a good example in that corridor, how the strategic mobility plan speaks to the comprehensive plan, the streets map plan, and the comprehensive transportation review, how that all really works together, because I think it's really important that we get the strategic mobility plan aligned with our comprehensive plan to make sure that all of our priorities are working together. But I think it's very difficult to visualize that for the public and for council members. So that would be my request for February, is to provide a live example of that. Any other questions, Mr. Eggleston, or?
I concur with what you just said.
Okay, Mr. Winston or Mr. Driggs? Mr. Driggs.
Yes, Madam Chair, I did have a question.
Uh-huh.
So Ed, in the early going, we talked about the strategic mobility plan, and it was a multi-billion-dollar concept for rail and so on. And now we're using the same name to describe, I believe, something different. It's like a lot of what used to be the strategic mobility plan has now become the TMN. And what you're talking about are provisions which, if I understand you right, can be implemented regardless of the progress of the TMN. Now, is that right? I mean, if we really achieved a separation such that the timeline in which we can adopt the TMN is kind of irrelevant to our progress on the strategic mobility plan?
Great question, and I think you've described it well. I don't know. Maybe I'll defer to Liz to just make sure we put the context of the TMN relative to the strategic mobility plan. I'd answer, but I defer to Liz first.
Yes, Councilmember Driggs, you absolutely characterized that correctly. The strategic mobility plan is in effect our policy document that establishes the mobility vision that we have for the future. We are, and that aligns both public and private investment. So that would help us in informing our capital improvement program, as well as informing how private development activities build out those mobility policies as well. The TMN, which is the Transformational Mobility Network, is a completely separate effort, and it is a funding strategy that helps us accelerate both transit and street investment to implement that bigger vision as well.
So again, given the magnitude of the TMN and its implications, we do feel that we can do a strategic mobility plan working from our existing CIP and as an adjunct to our UDO, and not have to kind of wait and find out what the outcome is. I mean, the TMN is going to have huge implications for a lot of what we're talking about, and it's in a state right now where we have this prospect of having to get approval for the text that we're going to relying on to fund it. So I guess you answered my question, but what you're saying is we can proceed with this, and we can have kind of mobility criteria in conjunction with our UDO and our 2040 plan that are realistic, are useful, even if we don't have an immediate success on the TMN process.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
All right, thank you.
And I would add, if I'm correct about this, whereas the strategic mobility plan is the vision of what we want to accomplish in our city, it also, and the TMN is the how do we pay for it, but we also have our capital budget, which could be paying for the strategic mobility plan. Of course, it just changes, what gets implemented in the strategic mobility plan if we have another funding source. But this is still ongoing, so that if we don't get a sales tax or whatnot, or find another additional revenue source, our existing revenue sources are what will pay for the strategic mobility plan. Is that fair to characterize it that way?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct. And for those of you as council members that have been with us for a while, you may recall we adopted a transportation action plan back in 2007, I believe it was, and we update that plan every 5 years. It is our current council-adopted transportation policy, along with Charlotte Walks and Charlotte Bikes. And so what the strategic mobility plan does for us is it really updates those current transportation policies and puts all of that into one document.
And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but I would argue what we're doing from a staff and planning and community engagement standpoint is sort of ignores the notion that there might be some other funding strategy, right? Our vision is the same based on and built on the comprehensive plan. Our needs are the same based on the growth that we're seeing. And as you mentioned, that the way we fund that today, we have the ability to prioritize and fund at a certain scale that investment through our capital investment program. So that's how we're staying focused. For us, it's really important that we're just using this as a way to make sure that all of that, and particularly our priorities and our policies, are completely aligned with all the great work that we've done in the last couple of years citywide on growth and planning. We just need to make sure that our mobility vision is completely aligned with that.
Okay, great, thank you. No more questions I see, so we will move on. Thanks, Mr. McKinney. Our next topic is our 90-day work plan, and I will turn that over to Ms. Babson to go through that.
All right. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, and welcome, council members. So real quickly, in the time that we have remaining, I want to walk through a conversation with you about a 90-day work plan. And so you will recall that on January 13th, the mayor sent a memo to all of council regarding committee communication, and really asking that committees start to set priorities to increase communication in this upcoming year. And as part of that, each committee now has a lead liaison. As Mayor Pro Tem mentioned at the start of the meeting, I am now your lead liaison after Taiwo Jayoba's departure from the city. And in addition to me, I cannot do it alone, certainly. You also have a staff team of resources available to you at every committee meeting. And so that'll be Ed McKinney, Allison Craig, and Jason Lawrence. And the goal is to really provide you, through this committee conversation, committee meeting structure, more information in advance of the meeting so that you can spend more time having discussion and discussing some of the upcoming items in that meeting, and spend less time having presentations provided to you. And so, again, the committee discussion today is to really provide you with some information about upcoming initiatives, plans, and policies that we anticipate coming through this committee in the coming year, and use that information to have a conversation about what have we missed, is there anything in addition to that, and really help Mayor Pro Tem and Councilmember Eggleston as the chair and the vice chair prepare for the February strategy session to provide that 90-day work plan overview to the entire council. Next slide, please. And so this slide and the following slide are, again, a table that we as staff put together to highlight for you a lot of the initiatives, plans, and policies and information that we anticipate coming to this committee over the next year, and want to put this information in front of you so you can consider that and help us prioritize when and how these items come to you. Mayor Pro Tem and I did have an opportunity to talk a bit about this last week, and as many of you know that have served on this committee for a while, in addition to the new committee members, we have quite a bit of programming that's already in place. Some of that you heard earlier today with the policy map. You'll also get updates with the Unified Development Ordinance work, and then the Strategic Mobility Plan. And then, of course, CATS has their Transit System Plan and several initiatives that are implementation tools and/or strategies that support that transit system plan. So if you'll flip to the next slide. And again, I wanted to just put this information together for you all as council members and committee members to give you a place to start having more conversation about these items and anything in addition to this that you want to make sure that we bring back as we prepare for conversations with you over the next 90 days and throughout the rest of the year.
Thank you, Liz. Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Babson? Mr. Winston?
Yes, less questions and more comments for Ms. Babson and the committee. This is obviously a part of the agenda for all of our committees that we are on. I just wanted to put it out there for the other two committees that I am on, Intergovernmental Committee, where I'm the co-chair, and the newly formed EEE committee. I think we should really think about how this committee and the work that we have on the table interacts with those two committees. From an intergovernmental committee approach, of course, we don't plan and our transportation efforts don't happen in a vacuum. They certainly, we are taking regional approaches, and we need to not just inform ourselves and get buy-in from ourselves and our constituents, but make sure folks in different parts of government that we interact with have some visibility, and not just constituent-based, but other electeds and other staff members. So I would like for us, and again, this is something we talked about in intergovernmental, of how do we take an intergovernmental approach, for instance, to the planning and transportation aspects and the work that we have on here. Of course, on the other side of that, the EEE committee, equity, engagement, and environment. We've had one meeting and we're kind of getting our feet under us about how we are going to take on the work in the short, medium, and long term. But I think some of the work specifically that we've done in the comprehensive 2040 plan by utilizing, for instance, an equitable growth framework to establish policies and look at different other policies across our organization. I think that might be a good starting point, but again, I think we need to, as a committee, figure out how we interact with the work of that committee going forward. And I hope we can kind of fit that in. I know we have a packed plate in this committee, but I think it's really important that we figure out how do we interact with EEE and intergovernmental. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. Great. Those points are really important. So thank you for bringing those up. And I know that the mayor, when she assigned committees to council members, there was intentionality about that, so that there was, you're on EEE and intergovernmental, so that there's council members that cross over and are aware of the conversations that need to take place. So thank you for bringing that point up. Mr. Driggs, did you have any questions? If not, I think we're done.
Thanks, Madam Chair. No.
Who? Oh, Mr. Graham. I don't think he is. Okay. I think that is it then. And if anybody objects, we can take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
And I'll second. Thank you very much, everybody.